Hey, remember when I did a trope talk on lampshading, and then I spent like a third of the video talking about something called Bathos that had examples that overlapped with lampshading, but let's be honest, was barely on topic and really only made it into the script because I evidently got really tilted about insincerity in media? Now, I love going off on tangents almost as much as you guys evidently like watching me go off on tangents for reasons I cannot fathom but am extremely grateful for. But the fact is, Bathos is a really interesting subject that I don't actually hate, and I think it deserves its own full-length dissection instead of just a footnote in another video. So, let's talk about it. As a refresher, bathos means rhetorical anticlimax, which basically means that thing in storytelling where a moment that feels like it could be profound or meaningful or powerful is rendered anticlimactic by something incongruously lowbrow cutting in and ruining the moment. A record scratch on the soundtrack, a cut to a wide shot, a sudden awkward silence after a big climactic build to nothing. Basically, if the scene could end with a fart joke cut in and be almost entirely unchanged, it's probably a moment of bathos. Now, the definition of bathos has actually drifted since it was originally coined in 1728 in the essay Bathos, or The Art of Sinking in Poetry, which was a parody of a Greek work of lit crit called Hypsos, on the sublime. Allegedly, there's a typo in the original work where pathos, meaning a general vibe of typically negative emotional experiences, was miswritten as bathos, an unrelated word meaning depth. The essay Bathos was a protracted dunk on contemporary poets the author didn't like because they had a habit of undercutting the profoundness of their own poetry by being bad at metaphor, like comparing something beautiful or divine to something weak or dumb-sounding, causing an effect of sinking in the audience. The essay is very incomprehensible to a modern reader because none of the poets getting dunked on are remembered nowadays on account of how they sucked, but the gist is comparable to modern things like the bad sex scene awards or when writers call eyes cerulean orbs and stuff like that. The idea is that comparing something profound or glorious or beautiful to something low or comedic or just plain goofy sounding is a good way to completely undercut the impact. It's not enough for a metaphor to be like this thing is like this other thing. The two things need to evoke a similar feeling. Comparing a sunrise to a bowl of Cheetos doesn't exactly feel poetic just because they're both orange. This early definition of bathos basically referred to situations where something intended to be highly impactful was undercut by the weakness of its execution. Now, while this original definition referred to an unintentional quirk of writing, the modern definition of bathos has shifted to mostly refer to purposeful undercutting, where the writer intentionally shifts the tone of a scene from something sincere or profound to something goofy or self-aware. But the old definition is still in use, and frankly, it can sometimes be hard to tell if the writer's doing it on purpose or not, so nowadays there are a few different kinds of bathos, and unpacking them sounds like a good place to start. The first form of bathos is basically the original one, where it's not that deep. In these instances, a story attempting to be deep and profound misses and belly flops into the shallows instead. These cases are almost always unintentional unless they're happening in story, like if a bad guy is monologuing and then gets interrupted by a good guy giggling at an innuendo in their phrasing or something, which is a case of in-universe bathos rather than one experienced directly by the audience. But outside of that sort of scenario, this version is basically by definition accidental, caused by clumsy metaphor or dubious execution, or otherwise the story just not living up to its own promise. This has some overlap with a separate trope, which is called NARM, for TV tropes reasons. The gist of NARM is that a moment intended to be emotionally impactful sparks an unrelated response in the audience because of some overlooked component of the execution, like a weird line delivery or a jarringly placed swear word, or dialogue that was clearly written by someone trying very hard to be cool, or just plain bad acting. So basically a moment that dislodges the audience's immersion in the story by virtue of kinda sucking, typically turning a serious moment into a comedic one because sometimes when the execution is bad enough, all you can do is laugh. These cases of bathos are accidental, highly subjective, and difficult to control for because they boil down to being a skill issue on the part of the creator, and it's always hard to hear that the way to make your art better is to just get good. Now, my theory is that this type of accidental bathos is indirectly responsible for the cases of intentional bathos, because most writers are very afraid of messing up a moment that's supposed to be sincere. Just like in real life, sincerity is vulnerability, and there's nothing worse than allowing yourself to be vulnerable and then getting laughed at. So a writer writing a sincere moment might be struck with fear that the sincerity will become the object of ridicule, and just like in real life, one of the easiest ways to feel in control in that situation is to be the first one to laugh. If you make fun of yourself, then when other people laugh, they're laughing with you, not at you. That's the theory anyway. In practice, what this means is that anyone who was taking you seriously will feel weird at best and actively mocked at worst, which is also likely to select for an audience that does want to laugh at you, since they're going to be the only people comfortable with the tone you're establishing. This is basically just another angle on the fact that self-deprecating humor is really only funny to the people who are comfortable deprecating you and uncomfortable to everyone else. But as a writer, this is an easy trap to slide into, and the threat of accidental bathos can incentivize writers to shy away from sincerity, because what if somebody thinks it's silly? So you end up with stories that intentionally undercut their moments of depth or emotional vulnerability so that they can be the first one laughing. That's how we get the subcategory of bathos that covers joke twists, where a scene is set up to play out in a serious way, often according to a trope that the audience is expected to be familiar with, like a slow-mo explosion walk, or a big romantic kiss, or a moment of emotional realness before a dangerous situation, or a heart-wrenching heroic sacrifice, and then the audience's expectations are subverted when instead they don't do that. Somebody doesn't respond according to the expected script. A heartfelt and emotional confession, instead of receiving a heartfelt and emotional response, gets a cut to a wide shot with crickets chirping, while the other characters either uncomfortably ignore or poke fun at their teammate for their emotional vulnerability. A dramatic and menacing threat from the big bad, instead of being received with fear or heroic determination, is met with an unrelated non sequitur as somebody comically misses the point. The number one clue that telegraphs that this form of bathos is happening is when the soundtrack starts getting a little weird. If the music is just a little too sincerely bombastic in the wind-up, it's a good sign that it's about to cut out on the punchline as a musical cue to direct how the audience should be feeling. This form of bathos is always purposeful, but it suffers from the same weakness as all plot twists. If it seems like the expected untwisty sequence of events would have been more fun or meaningful, the audience might regret the wasted potential. And if the story does it too often, the audience can get a bit sick of the story constantly twisting away from their expectations into dull insincerity for the sake of feeling clever or protecting itself from ridicule. For instance, while it can be fun to have characters that can lighten the mood or show their heroic fearlessness by cracking jokes in the face of peril, if the audience wants the characters to have a heartfelt and emotional conversation because there's a lot for them to talk about that hasn't been discussed, it can get pretty annoying if all they do is joke and derail and act too cool for the story they're in. If the villain could really use a cool moment to establish how terrifying they are, making it seem like nobody important takes them seriously is a really good way to convince the audience that they don't pose any sort of real threat. If the couple in the big romantic subplot are about to finally kiss, and then some comic relief sidekick pops up to give them a reason to put that off for another 2 seasons, the audience rage could be picked up by seismic stations 3 counties over. Setting up one thing and delivering another always risks frustrating the audience that would have preferred to see the first thing they were promised. That doesn't make it automatically bad, it just makes it risky to overuse. And if this form of comedy is motivated on the part of the author by fear of ridicule, the author is expressing a form of mistrust in their audience, and the audience can sometimes pick up on that. If a story feels embarrassed to exist, the audience is liable to feel embarrassment by proxy, even if they don't necessarily realize that's what they're picking up on. Joke twists are not inherently harmful to audience investment, and can be very funny, but like all twists, they affect audience trust in the story, which means if they happen too consistently, they'll train the audience to expect the twist. And because these twists are specifically located in climactic moments of emotional depth and sincerity, if the audience is trained to anticipate a subversive punchline, they are going to enter those emotional moments, the moments they should be at their most invested, reflexively uninvested. The big moments won't hit until the audience knows for sure that there's not going to be a joke. So if a story has a good mix of moments that are sincere versus moments that are wacky and off script, the audience won't fully check out, and the moments of comedy will be fun little highlights instead of a constant reminder that nobody thinks any of this matters. Speaking of which, the third major form of bathos is the unreaction. While a joke twist derails with humor, the unreaction derails with disinterest. The events of the story may be high stakes, impactful, emotionally profound, or just plain cool to look at, but if the characters' actions and dialogue don't reflect their circumstances, the impact of those events on the audience can be drastically weakened. This happens very often when a character is being framed as too cool for school, and this is being demonstrated by putting them in a perilous situation and then showing how totally unbothered they are by the danger. But the thing is, if the characters don't care about what's happening, it can make it harder for an audience to care about what's happening. While the intention is generally to show the audience that a character is very cool because they're completely blasé about a scenario the audience finds perilous, it can instead draw the audience to conclude that the situation is not actually perilous and thus not worth paying any real attention to, because the character isn't emotionally invested in anything that's going on. This form of bathos is typically unintentional because the effect the author wants to produce is making the character look cooler, not making the situation look boring. The bathos of this can be countered by letting the character react to their situation in other ways. If the author wants to communicate that this character is very cool and competent and not scared of the perilous situation, instead of broad apathy, they could instead show the character focusing intently on key details, checking in on their team's well-being, or being gleeful or enthusiastic about the process of navigating that situation, perhaps reveling in the challenge, admiring an exceptionally nightmarish threat, focusing on a seemingly very minor part of the scenario, like protecting their snack or continuing a heated argument with an ally. There are a ton of possibilities because this is basically just letting the character feel like a person uniquely navigating a scenario they may find challenging but not frightening. This communicates that the character is very competent and unafraid of their situation without making it seem like the character is uninvested in their situation or an emotionless vehicle for fight choreography, because it maintains the idea that this character cares about something, whether that's their friends, a good fight, getting to show off, eating something tasty, winning an argument, or whatever. It anchors the story for the audience by providing a clear point of sincerity, and sincerity, and the lack thereof, really is the crux of this trope. Cases of accidental bathos are perfectly sincere on the creator side of things, but the flawed execution makes it difficult for an audience to sincerely engage with the work. Even a good faith audience might find themselves laughing at a supposedly serious moment or bored and uninvested during the narrative climax if the story keeps kneecapping itself every time it builds up a hint of emotional investment. And cases of intentional bathos are purposely purposefully insincere, setting up an intention of honest, impactful storytelling and then subverting expectations so the audience takes the scene as a joke instead. Now, when I started this video, I said that I don't actually hate this trope, and I meant it, even if the last 5-ish minutes might make that hard to believe. The fact is, Bathos in its modern intentional form is a comedy trope, and comedy is all about timing. The problem a lot of people are having with Bathos is overexposure. If every line is a punchline, those jokes better be fresh as hell or they're gonna start getting old fast. And there's an element to Bathos that feels almost wasteful sometimes. As mentioned, the number one reason a plot twist can disappoint is if the theoretical untwisty version of events strikes the audience as more interesting or satisfying or fun to explore. And that means if you set up something profound and then deliver an empty punchline instead of a powerful moment, the loss of that potential moment can feel bad. Storytelling involves a process of planting and payoff, and if the thing you plant isn't the thing you pay off, you're gonna gradually teach your audience not to trust your storytelling to pay off the cool ideas you have planted. And an audience that can't trust a story is an audience that will struggle to get invested in the story. Like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, the story that cried punchline will train its audience to always anticipate a joke or a quip. And if the story does finally indulge in a moment of uninterrupted sincerity for a crucial moment in the plot, the audience might have trouble taking the moment at face value if they're too busy glancing around for the custard pie. A story that repeatedly smacks the audience for caring about the expectations that the story has set up is a story that's teaching its audience to keep its distance, and selecting for an audience that is not going to care. So the stories that use Bathos in a way I like tend to be really good at knowing what moments of theoretical sincerity they can afford to sacrifice or undercut without losing anything. The powerful and important moments that mean something to the characters get to be played straight, with full sincerity and maximum emotional impact for the audience. And the subversive moments of Bathos are worth the cost because they're funnier than the impact of the theoretical untwists they're replacing, since they typically either replace something small or something repetitive. There are also cases where the Bathosy punchline can be the less frustrating option than whatever trope it was replacing. For instance, if a character is pulling a noble heroic sacrifice and in the untwisty version of events is about to be dead or worse, it can be both funny and emotionally rewarding for a punchline to undercut that, saving the character and getting a laugh at the same time. Frustration at subverted expectations is liable to take a backseat to relief that they aren't losing an interesting character. Or if a character is about to be taken in by a villain's manipulations before swerving into a punchline instead, that couples Bathos with a heroic moment and can make it feel very triumphant, like the hero is winning so hard it's actually changing the genre a little. And some stories will manage to work in Bathos in a way that lets them have their cake and eat it too. For instance, you might get a story with a really cool fight in it, and then after a good chunk of really cool fight, things get interrupted by a Bathosy moment, like a goofy non sequitur or a complete tone shift or the bad guy getting randomly one-shotted by a truck. And while this is a moment of Bathos because it abruptly dunks the tone from seriousness into silliness, it isn't really replacing or costing us anything, because the only thing it's undercutting is more of the same fight scene, and we've already seen all the good fight choreography. It's only replacing something repetitive. Or maybe a very cool and fun character is out of commission and their replacement is unexpectedly very different from them, typically in a disappointing but comedic way. But that disappointment doesn't deprive the audience of the impact of the cool original version, because they still got in some time with them, and the downgrade manifests as an in-universe disappointment because the characters also recognize that their cool, sincere best option has been replaced by a comedically inferior version. Since the audience gets to see both the version of events that's played straight and the version of events that gets undercut with Bathos, it doesn't feel so much like one is being sacrificed for the other. There are also obviously ways to incorporate comedy into a scene that don't automatically undercut or derail that scene from its expected trajectory. A character can quip or comment sardonically about their situation without it grinding the plot to a screeching halt and making the whole thing seem pointless and uninvested. For one thing, characters can be both funny and sincere at the same time, lightening the mood without disconnecting them from the plot. In fact, there's plenty of comedy to be found in sincerity. Characters responding earnestly to rhetorical or metaphorical questions, or asking curious follow-up questions to stock villainous threats, or just generally taking their situation at actual presented face value rather than playing along with whatever stock tropey script the other character's trying to pull out. This can result in moments of Bathos that reinforce the emotional impact of the story rather than damaging it, because it's coming from a place of in-character sincerity and narrative investment, instead of the story feeling too embarrassed to let a real character moment play out. Bathos has gotten a bad rap. From me. Personally. People, and by people I mean me, love to rag on Joss Whedon quippy dialogue and Marvel dialogue, and he's right behind me, isn't he? And there's a reason for that. The reason is oversaturation. The reason is a desire for open, risky vulnerability. I was rewatching Fellowship of the Ring the other day, and when Aragorn and Arwen were on the bridge in Rivendell having their heart-to-heart, and she said, "I choose a mortal life," and the camera held on him for a second, I literally braced for a quip. I knew the movie I was watching. I knew Tolkien would never do me dirty like that. I've seen this movie before, and my brain still auto-completed a theory theoretical scenario where the soundtrack cut out and Aragorn went, "A more to life with me," right? Because, there's a lot of great guys out there, and Boromir was right upstairs, and Arwen smiled and kind of shook her head a little because, oh, men are so funny and she has to be the sensible one about it. And that glimpse of that darker timeline shook me. I brought that energy with me. It was in my head. The thing is, the Lord of the Rings movies are not Bathos free. Gimli's characterization is very different than it is in the books, and it's a change that smacks of insincerity. This noble, regal prince character is rewritten as the short, funny comic relief to contrast the tall, gorgeous, serious people in moments of tension by yelling about his beard and complaining about having to run places. And it feels like the director maybe didn't trust the audience to accept a trio of characters that were all serious, sincere, epic figures. Someone had to be funny, because stories need comic relief, and Merry and Pippin were busy getting hash blasted with the Ents. It's much less densely Bathos than a lot of modern stories, but it's still there, and it deprives the audience of some good Gimli content. But Bathos is the exception in those movies. Most moments are played completely straight, and the audience is not trained to expect a punchline when two characters are having a heart-to-heart. Gimli even gets moments of sincerity, sincere awe of Galadriel, sincere gut-wrenching grief in the mines of Moria. We still get to take him seriously sometimes, but the cost of his book-accurate character feels like a pretty hefty price to pay for not the beard. Bathos is not bad, but it can be symptomatic. It can signal that a writer or director doesn't trust their audience to take their story at face value or in good faith. Being vulnerable is scary, and on some level, telling a story you care deeply about is a bit like tearing your heart out and submitting it for peer review. But that's a risk and a sacrifice artists have to be willing to make in order to share the things they care so much about. Trying to shy away from that vulnerability risks sabotaging the creation to shield the creator's ego, and that bums me out. It's sad to see a story plant a beautiful, nuanced concept and then break it because they got scared of paying it off. It shows you what the story could have been if it were sincere, and then it kills it for a laugh because it decided you were already laughing. And I could insert a punchline here because that's haha funny and this is a haha funny channel, but that would be hypocritical of me, and it's right behind me, isn't it? Huh? Okay, alright. Good night, everybody. So yeah,